The automatic doors of the Maple Hollow Police Department hissed open with a sudden whoosh, the morning stillness interrupted by the sound of small, frantic footsteps on the linoleum floor. Behind the reception desk, Officer Donna Rowe looked up from her paperwork just in time to see a tiny figure rush in. A boy, no older than 7, his face streaked with dirt and tears, clothes hanging off his thin frame like they belonged to someone twice his size. His chest heaved with every breath, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with urgency and fear. "Please," he gasped, gripping the edge of the desk with trembling fingers. "Please, you have to arrest my dad. Right now. Please." Dana stood up so fast her chair rolled backward and crashed into the filing cabinet. Her heart dropped as she took in the boy's wild eyes too full of fear for a child that age. There was something raw in his tone, not just fear, but something deeper, desperation, trauma. Something inside her said this wasn't the usual runaway situation. Hey, it's okay," she said gently, walking around the desk and kneeling to meet his eye level. "You're safe now. What's your name, sweetie?" The boy's lips quivered. Eli Thompson." Dana gently placed her hand on his shoulder, only to feel him flinch hard under her touch. That reaction alone told her more than any words could. "Okay, Eli. I'm Dana. Can you tell me what happened? Why do you want us to arrest your dad?" Eli looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to storm through the doors at any moment. He pressed himself into the corner between the desk and the wall, eyes wide, voice rising. "He's gonna hurt her," he said he would this time. He was holding the thing again. He gets scary when he holds the thing. "What thing, honey?" Dana asked, trying to remain calm as her partner, Officer Malik Jones, quietly approached and signaled her to keep going. He was already picking up the phone to alert dispatch. Eli's hands balled into fists. The belt. The leather one. The one with the big buckle. But this time he said he didn't care anymore. He told Mommy if she screamed, he'd make sure we both didn't wake up tomorrow. Dana's face turned pale. Malik was already giving details to dispatch. Possible domestic violence. Immediate response needed. Suspect may be armed with a blunt weapon. Child present. Address pending. She turned back to Eli. "Eli, where's your mom now?" Eli swallowed. "At home. I ran out the back door when he wasn't looking. I ran and ran. I didn't know where else to go." Dana's voice caught in her throat. "Do you know your address, sweetheart?" He nodded quickly, then recited it. A little house on Whitmore Lane, one Dana remembered passing often on her patrols. It had always seemed so unremarkable from the outside. Yellow paint, slightly peeling. A wooden porch swing that looked handmade, nothing that screamed danger. Nothing that warned her that a child like Eli was living in fear just behind those walls. Moments later, officers were en route, but the adrenaline didn't ease. Dana stayed with Eli, her arm lightly draped around his shoulders as he sat on the floor, knees hugged to his chest. She offered him a juice box from the break room fridge, but he barely sipped it. His eyes remained wide and distant, like he was watching something only he could see. As the minutes passed, bits and pieces of the boy's world spilled out in scattered sentences. "He wasn't always like this. Before my baby sister died, he used to smile. She got sick, really sick, and he couldn't afford the hospital. They said insurance didn't cover it all. After she was gone, he changed. He drinks a lot now. He says it's the only way to forget her." Dana blinked hard, struggling to maintain her composure. The pain in Eli's voice wasn't just sadness, it was burden. He wasn't just surviving. He was carrying the emotional weight of his entire household. "He cries sometimes when he thinks I'm asleep," Eli whispered. "I hear him say sorry. I hear him talk to her, my sister. He tells her he tried. But when he wakes up, he forgets. He gets angry. He blames Mom. He says if she hadn't called the ambulance so late, maybe." Dana looked away for a second, wiping her eyes discreetly. This boy had seen more heartbreak in his 7 years than many experienced in a lifetime. And still, his instinct had been to protect, to run through the streets alone, to barge into a police station, not for himself, but for his mother. "Do you know what courage is, Eli?" she asked softly. He looked up, confused. "It's what you did today," she said. "It's choosing to speak up when it's scary. It's doing the right thing, even if your voice shakes. You were brave today, and you might have just saved your mom's life." Eli didn't respond, but he leaned ever so slightly into her side. The tension in his small body relaxed just enough to tell her he'd heard her, even if he didn't know how to say it. A few minutes later, a call crackled over the station's radio. Officers had arrived at the Thompson residence. The situation had escalated quickly. The father, Nathan Thompson, had refused to answer the door, screaming obscenities from behind it. When officers forced their way in, they found him in the kitchen, drunk and belligerent, swinging a leather belt with a large metal buckle. Eli's mother, Rachel, was found huddled in the bathroom, a bruise blossoming across her cheekbone. Nathan had resisted arrest, cursing the officers, blaming them, blaming his wife, blaming the world. But he was now in custody. Rachel had been taken to the hospital for evaluation. No broken bones, just deep bruises and deeper emotional wounds. But she was safe. When Donna got the call, she hung up and turned to Eli. "They'd got him," she said. "Your mom is safe. You did it, Eli. You really did." The boy's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they weren't just from fear or sorrow. They were from something else. A slow realization that the nightmare, for now, had paused. That he could breathe again. That night, after Child Protective Services took Eli to a temporary foster home, Dana sat in the locker room, still in uniform, staring at the wall. What had begun as a normal Tuesday had turned into a moment that would live with her forever. And she couldn't shake the thought. How many other kids were out there like Eli, waiting for someone to listen, waiting for a moment to be brave enough to scream for help. And more haunting than that, how many never did. A soft rain tapped against the window of the foster home as Eli sat quietly on the edge of a neatly made bed, his small backpack at his feet. Inside were the only things he brought with him: 2 worn t-shirts, a cracked plastic dinosaur with one missing leg, and a faded photo of his mother holding him as a baby. The picture had bent corners and a small tear across the top, but Eli handled it like it was made of glass. It was the only thing that still felt like home. The room was unfamiliar, too clean, too quiet. The sheets smelled like lemon detergent instead of his mom's vanilla perfume. The walls were covered in cheerful wallpaper, blue skies, and cartoon animals. But it all felt fake, like someone had tried too hard to make it feel happy. Eli didn't want happy. He wanted familiar. He wanted his mother. He wanted to wake up and find out this had all been a bad dream. From downstairs, he heard soft voices. Mrs. Clayton, the foster mother, was speaking to someone on the phone in a low tone. Eli didn't move from the bed. He didn't want to explore. He didn't want toys or snacks. He didn't even want the warm cookies she'd left out on a plate. All he could think about was whether his mom was okay, whether she was scared, whether she was mad at him for what he did. The memory of his father's face when the police arrived flashed in his mind. Red with fury, eyes wild, veins bulging in his neck. Eli had peeked through the back fence as they pulled him out in handcuffs. He hadn't seen his mom then. Just her voice crying out as officers shouted. It echoed in his head even now. A soft knock came at the bedroom door. "Hey, buddy," Mrs. Clayton said gently as she peeked in. "You doing okay?" Eli nodded once, though it wasn't true. She walked in and sat at the edge of the bed, careful not to crowd him. She was older, with kind eyes and a sweater that smelled like laundry and cinnamon. "I spoke with Officer Dana. She said your mom's going to be okay. She's at the hospital now, and they're taking good care of her." Eli looked down at his shoes. Is she mad at me? No, sweetie, she said softly. No, she's not. She's proud of you. I told on Dad, Eli whispered. I broke the rules. Mrs. Clayton sighed and brushed a bit of hair from his forehead. You broke the silence. That's not the same thing. Sometimes, grown-ups need help too, even if they don't ask for it. He didn't respond. His chest felt too tight. Do you want to write her a letter? She asked. Something we can give her tomorrow. Eli thought for a moment, then slowly nodded. She smiled. Okay, I'll leave some paper and crayons on the table downstairs. Take your time. After she left, Eli stayed on the bed a while longer, then slowly slid off, grabbing his backpack and the photo. He made his way downstairs, where the scent of vanilla cookies lingered and a lamp cast a warm glow across the living room. He sat at the table and stared at the blank page in front of him. He didn't know what to say. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the crayon. It took a few tries, but eventually, the words came in large, crooked letters. Dear Mom, I'm sorry I ran. I didn't want to leave you. I was scared. I didn't want you to get hurt. I love you. Please don't be mad. Please get better soon. I miss you. Love, Eli. He stared at the note for a long time before folding it carefully and slipping it into his backpack next to the photo. Then, for the first time that night, he allowed himself to lie back on the bed and close his eyes. The next morning brought more cold rain, gray skies, and the arrival of Officer Dana Rowe in civilian clothes. She smiled warmly as she walked into the house, her badge tucked away but her eyes just as kind. Hey there, little man, she said as Eli looked up from the table. I got some news. Eli stood up slowly. Is my mom okay? She is, Dana said. She's at a safe place now, not at the hospital anymore. A shelter for people who need help. It's a nice place. There's a counselor there, and warm food, and other moms and kids. Eli's shoulders sagged with relief. He held out the folded letter. Can you give this to her? Dana took it with both hands like it was sacred. I sure will. As she tucked it into her jacket pocket, her tone grew a little more serious. Eli, I want you to know something important. What you did yesterday. Not many adults are brave enough to do that. You spoke up. You asked for help. That takes courage. Eli didn't feel brave. He just felt tired. I don't want to go back, he whispered. Dana crouched beside him. You don't have to. Not now. The court will decide what happens next. But for now, your mom is going to get help. And so are you. That afternoon, Rachel Thompson sat in a quiet room at the women's shelter, her hand shaking slightly as she unfolded the letter delivered by Officer Rowe. Her face crumpled as she read the crooked handwriting. The tears came hard and fast, but for the first time in months, they weren't just from fear or regret. They were from hope. For years, Rachel had made excuses for Nathan. He was grieving. He'd lost his job. He was broken. And somehow, she convinced herself that staying was safer than leaving. That keeping Eli under the same roof was better than shattering what little was left of their family. But it wasn't until her son ran to the police that she saw the truth. That their silence was only feeding the darkness, and that her son had saved her in a way she never expected. The next day, a caseworker named Leela met with Rachel to begin the long road of healing. Therapy sessions, legal protection, housing assistance. Rachel listened, nodded, and finally asked the question she had been holding in her chest like a burning coal. When can I see my son? Leela smiled gently. Soon. He's safe, and he misses you. That evening, Eli lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling. He didn't cry. Not anymore. Something had shifted inside him. Something small, but strong. A flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. That maybe love didn't have to hurt. That maybe his mom would be okay. And maybe he would too. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting golden streaks across the dew-slicked grass outside the courthouse. Eli sat on a bench beside Officer Dana Rowe, legs swinging nervously, shoes barely grazing the cement. He wore jeans a size too big and a blue hoodie that Mrs. Clayton had found tucked away in a box marked "Donations." It still smelled faintly of lavender. Clutched tightly in his hand was a small paper flower he'd folded during breakfast, his own invention, crafted from napkins and hope. The courthouse building loomed behind them, tall and pale, like something out of a grown-up storybook. Inside, adults were making decisions about things Eli didn't fully understand. Guardianship, custody, testimony. Words that sounded big and cold. All he knew was that people in suits were deciding whether he could see his mother again. Dana watched him out of the corner of her eye. She could tell he was trying not to ask questions, trying to be brave, but he didn't need to pretend with her. She'd been there when he burst into the station, eyes wild, heart broken open. She'd seen children in pain before, but not like Eli. Not with that combination of raw terror and deep, aching love. "Wanna take a walk?" she asked gently. Eli shrugged, still gripping the paper flower. "Do we have time?" "We've got time." They strolled toward the edge of the park across the street. Squirrels darted through the grass. Somewhere, a child's laughter rang out from a distant swing set. It felt like another world. A better one. "My mom used to take me to parks," Eli said suddenly. "Before everything." Dana nodded, letting the silence breathe between them. "She had this way of making everything feel okay," he continued, eyes on the sidewalk. "Like even if we had nothing to eat, she'd light candles and make it feel special, like it was part of the plan." Dana's heart ached at the honesty of it. "She still loves you like that," she said, "even now." Eli looked up at her. "Will they let me see her?" "I think so," she replied. "It might not be today, but soon." Inside the courthouse, Rachel sat with trembling hands in a small waiting room, dressed in borrowed clothes from the shelter. Her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her eyes still puffy from too many sleepless nights. But there was a steadiness in her now, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting. Her advocate, a young woman named Nina, sat beside her, going over the day's agenda. Rachel tried to listen, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Eli. Was he scared? Did he think she'd given up on him? She wanted so badly to hold him, to tell him he'd done the right thing, that his bravery had cracked open the walls she'd spent years building around her shame, that he had saved her from herself. Judge Morales entered the courtroom with a calm, authoritative presence. She was known for her fairness, but also for her deep empathy in family cases. She had read Eli's file twice. The words written there haunted her. The police report, the hospital records, the social worker's observations. But what struck her most was the letter Eli had written. It had been submitted as part of the file. She had read it privately in her chambers. "Dear Mom, I'm sorry I ran. I didn't want to leave you. I was scared. I didn't want you to get hurt. I love you. Please don't be mad. Please get better soon. I miss you. Love, Eli." She had sat in silence for a long time afterward. When Eli was finally called in to speak, it wasn't like he'd imagined. No bright lights, no shouting, just a warm, quiet room where he was allowed to sit beside Dana and answer questions softly. The judge spoke directly to him, her voice gentle, not scary. "Eli, can you tell me why you went to the police station that day?" He nodded, eyes fixed on the edge of the table. "Because I was scared. I didn't want my mom to get hurt anymore. And I didn't want to get hurt either." The judge nodded. "That was very brave. Do you love your mom?" His head shot up. "More than anything." "Do you think she loves you?" Eli blinked, then gave the tiniest smile. "Yeah, I think she does. Would you like to see her again?" "Yes," he said. "Please." That night, in a supervised room at the shelter's visitation center, Rachel stood nervously by the door, fidgeting with the sleeves of her cardigan. Every second felt like 100 heartbeats. She didn't know what to say, what he'd look like, whether he'd be scared or angry or cold. Then the door opened, and Eli stepped in. He stopped when he saw her, mouth parted slightly, eyes wide. She looked thinner, tired, but she was still his mom. Still the woman who used to make him pancakes in the shape of letters. Still the woman who sang him lullabies even when her own heart was breaking. "Hi, baby," Rachel whispered. Eli's bottom lip trembled. He took one step, then another, then suddenly ran straight into her arms. She dropped to her knees and wrapped him up, holding him so tight it felt like they might never come apart again. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, Eli." "I'm not mad," he whispered into her neck. "I just wanted you to be safe." And for a long time, they didn't let go. Outside the room, Dana stood watching through the glass, arms crossed, a quiet pride in her chest. This was the part of the job that made it worth it. The part where survival gave way to healing. Rachel and Eli spoke for an hour. They talked about everything and nothing. About how he was doing in school. About how she was taking classes at the shelter. About how they were both getting better. Before they parted, Eli handed her the napkin flower. "It's not real," he said, "but I made it for you." Rachel held it like it was a diamond. "It's perfect." As he walked away with the caseworker, Eli looked back and gave her a small wave. It wasn't a goodbye. Not this time. It was a promise. 2 weeks passed, each day peeling back a layer of silence that had once smothered Rachel's life. The shelter had become more than a roof over her head. It was a place where shame was met with compassion, and wounds, both visible and hidden, were tended to gently. Every morning, she sat at the same table with a cup of weak coffee and a pencil in hand, scribbling down things she remembered about Eli. Things he might forget if she didn't capture them now. Like the way he used to hum when brushing his teeth, or how he loved putting ketchup on everything. She even wrote about the time he taped googly eyes onto their fruit so they could pretend they had banana friends. These memories weren't just sentimental. They were her compass. Tiny lights guiding her back to motherhood, back to herself. Every evening, she attended group therapy. At first, she barely spoke, eyes downcast, voice cracking when asked to share. But slowly, her words began to take root. One night, she told the group about Eli's visit, about the paper flower, about how it made her feel like someone believed in her again. The room fell quiet. Then someone clapped. Then another. Until every woman in that dimly lit room was applauding, not just Rachel's story, but the courage it took to begin telling it. Meanwhile, Eli's world had begun to stitch itself back together in its own fragile way. He was placed with a temporary foster family, a quiet couple named Thomas and Rita who lived in a modest home with a sleepy old dog named Jasper. They weren't flashy or overly cheerful, which Eli appreciated. They just let him be. Every night, Rita tucked him in and left the door cracked open, just as he liked. She didn't ask him about his mother unless he brought her up. When he did, she listened without interrupting. One night, he whispered, "She's not a bad person. Just, she got stuck in something bad." Rita nodded and brushed the hair from his forehead. "Good people sometimes get lost," she said, "but they can find their way back." At school, things were harder. Whispers followed him in hallways. Kids stared too long, asked awkward questions. Some were kind, like his classmate Mia, who offered to sit with him at lunch. No questions asked. But the feeling of being different lingered. Still, Eli tried his best to focus on class. He liked math. It made sense. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't hurt. They just were. Every Friday, he had a supervised call with his mom. At first, it was awkward. Short answers, long pauses, but by the third call, he was showing her a drawing he made of a spaceship hotel and asking her if she still remembered the secret pancake recipe they used to make on Sundays. "I wrote it down in my notebook," she said, smiling. "Still got it memorized, though." I do too, he said proudly. That same week, Rachel was approved for a job training program. She hadn't worked in years, not since Eli was a toddler, but she jumped at the chance. It was at a downtown bookstore that also served coffee and hired women rebuilding their lives. She started with stocking shelves, sweeping floors, and learning the register. By the end of her first week, she'd sold 3 poetry books and gotten a smile from the grumpy regular, who usually ignored everyone. There was a rhythm to her days now. Work in the morning, therapy in the afternoon, writing letters to Eli before bed. She'd started tucking them into a small box beside her cot, each envelope dated, each one sealed with the hope that someday she could give them to him in person. One night, as the rain tapped gently on the shelter windows, Rachel sat in her room and reread a note from Eli. It had arrived in a small envelope decorated with stickers. Inside was a drawing of a house, with 2 stick figures labeled me and you, and a dog named Maybe. Clearly a hint. Underneath, he'd written, I miss you. I'm proud of you. Love, Eli. The words hit her like sunlight through fog. She held the paper to her chest and wept, not out of sorrow, but out of release. She was making her way back to him, one day at a time. Around that same moment, Officer Dana Rowe sat at her kitchen table flipping through the case files she kept stored in her private binder. Eli's case had taken up more space than most, not just physically, but emotionally. She'd seen hundreds of children in crisis over the years, but Eli had stuck. Maybe it was his courage. Maybe it was the way he still believed in love, even after everything. She had recently applied to become a court-appointed advocate for his case, something she'd never done before. She told herself it was just to make sure things went smoothly. But truthfully, it was more than that. Eli reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten, that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most weight, and when you really listen, they can change everything. A few days later, Rachel was called into a meeting with her social worker, a woman named Karen who spoke with a firm but fair tone. She sat across from Rachel with a manila folder, the kind that always seemed to hold lives inside it. You've been making incredible progress, Karen said, tapping the folder lightly. But there's something you need to understand. Rachel tensed. The court is considering giving you shared custody in stages. Supervised visitation is already underway, but we're moving toward a longer-term plan. That said, this next step will be challenging. It's not about proving you're a good mother. We already believe that. It's about stability, consistency, and resilience. Rachel nodded slowly, tears brimming. I'll do whatever it takes. Karen offered a gentle smile. We know, and Eli knows too. The news was like breath returning to a body that had forgotten how to inhale. Rachel walked out of that meeting with her head high for the first time in years. She didn't have much, no savings, no fancy clothes, no promises, but she had a second chance. And that was enough. Later that week, during their next in-person visit, Eli walked into the room carrying a homemade comic book titled The Adventures of Supermom. In it, a caped mother with curly hair and lightning boots battled monsters made of sadness, shadows, and bad memories, all while protecting a small boy named Eli with a glowing heart. Rachel laughed so hard she cried. Do I really have lightning boots? She asked. You do now, he grinned. As the visit drew to a close, Rachel hugged him tight. She whispered into his ear, I'm coming back to you. Not all at once, but soon. Eli nodded, resting his head against her shoulder. I know. I'll wait. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Not quite sunrise, but close. Rachel sat at the small kitchen table of her transitional apartment, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea gone cold. The apartment was bare bones. Just a bed, a table, a dresser, and a creaky bathroom. But it was hers. She had earned it after nearly 4 months in the shelter and strict monitoring. This small space with its flickering ceiling light and peeling linoleum was a milestone. It meant trust. It meant progress. It meant she was no longer just surviving. She was rebuilding. Each morning, she woke up at 6, made a cup of instant coffee, and practiced reading books aloud to herself. Children's books, mostly. She said the words slowly and with expression, because that's what Eli loved. When she made the voices funny or whispered dramatically during the scary parts, she was preparing for something she hadn't dared hope for in months. Their first unsupervised weekend together. She'd earned it with a record of consistency, never missing a therapy session, never being late to work, keeping her weekly check-ins with her social worker. The bookstore cafe had even offered her a full-time position, with the possibility of training as a shift supervisor. For the first time in years, she had income she could depend on, and people who greeted her with genuine warmth. Rachel stared at the hand-drawn calendar pinned to her wall, every square leading up to Saturday marked with a big red X. Only 2 more days. 2 more days, and Eli would be staying overnight. She caught herself smiling, and then immediately felt fear creep in behind it. What if she messed this up? What if something happened? Her hand reached for the drawer where she kept the letter. Eli's last note, folded with the precision of someone who cared deeply. She opened it again, rereading the words for the 100th time. Can't wait to see you again. I've been practicing making pancakes too. Maybe we can cook them together this time. Love you, always. E. It steadied her. He hadn't given up on her. She couldn't give up on herself. That evening, she walked to the corner grocery store, counting out coins and crumpled bills to buy pancake mix, syrup, and a small carton of strawberries. The cashier, a teenage girl with bubblegum pink nails, looked up and said softly, "Your kid coming over or something?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, first time, in a long time." The girl smiled. "He's lucky to have you. Hope it's awesome." Rachel left with the groceries in one hand and a heart just a little fuller. Meanwhile, across town, Eli was packing his backpack with meticulous care. 2 shirts, 1 hoodie, his toothbrush, and his favorite comic book. He tucked in a worn stuffed animal named Mr. Finn, half shark, half dog, and then paused. From a drawer, he pulled out the small paper flower he had made months ago at the shelter visit. It was a little crumpled now, but still whole. He added it to the bag. Rita, his foster guardian, watched him from the doorway. "You sure you don't want me to pack you an extra snack? Just in case." Eli grinned. "We're making pancakes. I'm gonna teach her the secret swirl trick." Rita raised an eyebrow. "The swirl trick?" "Yup. You swirl the batter in the pan like a galaxy. It makes them taste better." She smiled. "Sounds like magic." "It is," he said earnestly. "Pancake magic." Saturday arrived crisp and cool, the trees outside Rachel's window painted in gold and rust. She cleaned the apartment twice, reheated coffee 3 times, and changed her shirt 4 times. When the knock finally came, her breath caught. She opened the door to see Karen, the social worker, standing with Eli, who held a small duffel bag and wore the biggest smile Rachel had ever seen. "Hey, buddy," she said, kneeling. "Hey, Mama," he said, already stepping forward into her arms. Karen watched them quietly for a moment, then smiled. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon to check in. Remember, call me if anything feels overwhelming." Rachel nodded, her eyes never leaving her son's face. "I will. Thank you." Once the door closed, silence fell between them. Not awkward, but sacred. "Want to see the pancake magic?" Eli asked. Rachel laughed, tears escaping before she could stop them. "You have no idea how much." The day passed like a dream. They cooked pancakes, badly at first. The first 2 stuck to the pan. The third fell apart, but the fourth swirled just right. Eli's trick worked. They laughed so hard, Rachel had to sit down. Later, they built a blanket fort in the living room, watched cartoons from her laptop, and played a game where they tried to guess which clouds looked like animals. That night, Eli lay in the bed, Rachel next to him on a mattress she had pulled into the room so he wouldn't be alone. "Mama," he whispered. "Yeah. You were brave. You still are." She turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Because brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do stuff even when you are." Rachel reached out, brushing hair from his eyes. "You're the bravest person I know." He reached under the pillow and pulled out the paper flower. "I saved it. Thought maybe it would keep us both safe." Rachel took it gently in her hand, marveling that something so small, so fragile, had survived. "I think it already has." She held his hand until his breathing slowed and his eyes fluttered shut. And in that stillness, surrounded by chipped paint and old blankets and the soft sound of a child's dreams, Rachel finally exhaled. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know how many more obstacles waited in the shadows. But for this moment, she had her son. She had hope. And sometimes, that was enough to begin again. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, painting golden lines across Eli's sleeping face. Rachel watched him in quiet awe, the rise and fall of his chest grounding her in a reality she had dared not hope for just months ago. She hadn't slept much, not out of worry, but out of a deep, overwhelming joy she was too afraid to miss. Every small sound he made in the night, every shift and turn, reminded her this was real. He was really here. She moved gently out of bed, careful not to wake him. In the kitchen, she started coffee and stared at the refrigerator where his drawing from the day before, two stick figures holding hands beneath a massive pancake-shaped sun, was proudly taped up. It had been years since she'd smiled first thing in the morning. She wasn't sure she even remembered how. But today it came without effort, bubbling up from somewhere deep and hard-earned. When Eli finally woke, it was to the smell of toast and eggs. "I thought maybe we could try something besides pancakes today," she said, placing a plate in front of him. He gave her a mock-serious look. "Betraying the pancake swirl, huh?" Rachel laughed, ruffling his hair. "Just mixing it up." They ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his school, his favorite teacher, a girl who could draw dragons perfectly, a boy who once got his head stuck in the stair railing. Rachel soaked it in, cataloging every detail. For the first time in years, she felt like she was no longer standing outside his world looking in. She was part of it again. After breakfast, they took a walk through the nearby park. The leaves crackled underfoot, and the trees were nearly bare, their skeletal branches drawing lacework shadows on the pavement. Eli skipped ahead, arms stretched like airplane wings. Rachel followed, smiling. "You know," Eli said, pausing by the duck pond, "I used to dream about this. Just us, walking and talking. Not scared anymore." Rachel knelt beside him. "Me too, honey. Me too." They sat on a bench for a long time, tossing bits of old bread to the ducks and naming them like they used to when he was small: Professor Waddles, Sir Quackington, and Queen Beakabeth. When they returned to the apartment, Karen was already waiting outside, leaning against her car. Rachel's stomach tightened reflexively, though she knew it shouldn't. Eli ran to her. "We made toast instead of pancakes today." Karen laughed. "Living on the edge, huh?" Rachel stood in the doorway, watching them. Karen's presence reminded her of all the work still ahead: the court hearings, the progress reports, the scrutiny. Nothing was guaranteed, but it didn't feel crushing the way it once did. Karen met Rachel's eyes and nodded slightly. "How did it go?" Rachel exhaled. "Better than I imagined." He was happy. Karen looked at Eli, now pretending to battle a dragon-shaped shadow on the sidewalk, and smiled. "I can tell." There was silence between them for a moment. "You've changed, Rachel," Karen said softly. "Not just on paper. I can see it in how you carry yourself. You're not running anymore. You're standing your ground." Rachel looked down at her hands, surprised at the lump forming in her throat. "I didn't know I had it in me." Karen touched her shoulder. "You always did. You just needed time to remember." Eli ran up, panting. "Can I come back next weekend too?" Karen crouched to meet his eyes. "That's the plan, kiddo." Rachel blinked hard to keep from crying. As they drove away, Rachel stood at the doorway, watching the car disappear down the street. The silence that settled in was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful, filled with echoes of laughter and crumbs of hope scattered on the floor like glitter. Over the following weeks, the visits continued. They painted together, read bedtime stories, made spaghetti that stuck to the wall when thrown for science, and even burned cookies beyond recognition. And then, on a Monday morning just before the holidays, Rachel got the call. The court had ruled in her favor. Full custody would be reinstated under continued review, with community support. She stood in the middle of the bookstore cafe, phone still to her ear, eyes wide. Her manager paused mid-sentence at the register. "Everything okay?" Rachel nodded slowly. "More than okay." Eli moved back in 2 weeks later, his world packed into 2 duffel bags and 1 overflowing heart. The first night, they danced in the living room to music from her phone, the volume too loud, the moves ridiculous. But they didn't care. They were home. Later, as they lay under mismatched blankets, Eli whispered, "You saved us, Mama." Rachel kissed his forehead. "No, we saved each other." In a world where stories often end with defeat, theirs became one of quiet, relentless triumph. The kind of story that reminds you healing is messy, that love isn't always perfect, but it is powerful, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to keep showing up, even when you're scared. They still had bad days. There were still moments when the past tried to creep in, when old doubts knocked at the door, but Rachel no longer opened it. She was a mother, a survivor, a woman who had once stood at the edge of herself and chosen not to fall. And every time Eli laughed, every time he looked at her like she was the safest place in the world, she knew she hadn't just rebuilt a life. She had rewritten a legacy.